you for inviting me to speak this year. I'm particularly pleased to be standing here in this room in the Carnegie Library, because two of the people that I would have seen as influential in Irish history and would be heroes in certain ways actually spoke in this room. One of them was Alice Milligan. Alice Milligan was a Methodist Republican, the first woman to go to Methodist College in Belfast, and she was the editor of Anshan van Vught magazine in the early 1900s. And the other famous person who stood here and actually spoke twice on Irish history was Pádraig Pearse, who came out I think around 1909 or 1910. So thank you for coming at this hour of the morning. I just want to make an admission before I start. I am not a historian of Malahide, so if anybody was expecting me to be an expert on Malahide, I may not be. I know a little bit about Malahide, but a lot of my research has been on politics through the prism of local government. So I know more about the water supply in Malahide and some of the politics than I might know about the history of Malahide. And that is what this is about. This is about a period in which, from the 1870s through to about 1910, a controversy over the water supply in Malahide, over the sanitary committees, and a gaining of power and influence by nationalists, and using the sanitation committee in Malahide to do that. And it's a fascinating case study of how nationalists took power before 1922. And after 1922, in this country, we had the ability to run the country. We had the ability to administrate because we had learned it in the boards of guardians, in the library committees, in committees of the GAA, committees of the Gaelic League. And this is a fascinating study of how that worked. Some of you may know this particular street, St. James's Terrace. It hasn't changed hugely, other than if you looked at it today, you probably wouldn't see a lot of the ground floor because it will be obscured by cars and vehicles. But that is at the centre of this particular controversy. So I'm just going to give you a little background to Fingal and North County Dublin at that time. So we're looking at around the turn of the 20th century. The north and west of the county was mainly grazing of cattle fattening, and the south and the east was crop growing. So you had everything from the growing of barley and wheat for the brewing and distilling industries in Dublin. It's often been said in relation to Dublin that all Dublin had was beer, biscuits and whiskey, and they were the main industries in Dublin around this time. But they used to get a lot of the raw materials from areas like this. There was also market gardening, which is the growing of vegetables. So if you look around Rush, Lough Shinny, Skerries, some of those areas would have concentrated on that type of farming. And you had potatoes. For me, the key change in terms of local politics and in terms of local administration is the 1898 Local Government Act, which created Dublin County Council and subsidiary rural district councils. So in this area, we would be looking at Balrodary Rural District Council and North Dublin Rural District Council. Howth had an urban district council, and Balbriggan had a town council going back to 1860. And in terms of the area, the RIC police intelligence reports, district inspectors' reports, probably tell us more on an ongoing basis about this area when they say the farmers of County Dublin are all well-to-do men, and it's usually in a peaceable state. So this was a quiet area. People were generally better off than other parts of the country, although it still had a significant layer of poverty. So if we look at Malahide, here's a couple of descriptions of Malahide in 1884. It was a seaside town, had a population of 653. It was served by the railway, which helped it develop into a seaside town. It had a large hotel, originally the Royal Hotel, and then later named the Grand Hotel. Behind the hotel were sea baths, And sea baths and spas and salt baths were very popular in Victorian times, and they would have drawn people to seaside towns. The Talbot estate, Malahide domain, dominated the local economy, and the description that was given in Tom's directory in that year was of many handsome private residences. And it's the people in those residences that I'm going to talk about to an extent today. It also had profitable oyster beds as well, which were the property of the Lord of the Manor, which would have been Talbot de Malahide. During this period from the 1870s to 1910 that I'm talking about, the administrative units of local government changed. So we would have started with a county Dublin grand jury who would have been responsible for the levying of county taxes for local infrastructure. That is the courthouse in Kilmainham, where they used to meet, and the first meetings of Dublin County Council from 1899 on were there until they purchased the premises in what was then Rutland Square and is now Parnell Square. Balroddery Rural District Council used to meet in the union buildings in just outside Lusk. There's very little of them left now, but that building there that you see, the one in the middle, which looks like a fine country hotel, that is actually Balroddery Workhouse. So that's what a workhouse would have looked like. There would have been various different dormitories and sections in behind it, but it looks far more salubrious than we would associate workhouses with. Now, my study of workhouses over time, I see them as progressive. I see them as the first provision of social welfare, of relief, of outdoor relief, of a medical provision system. And the last one down the bottom is the new, there was a previous one to this, Malahide Dispensary. And we're going to concentrate on the Malahide Dispensary District and later Sanitary District today. Now, the Poor Law Act was set up in 1838 in order to provide relief care, mainly indoor relief care through a workhouse system, because Ireland was so poor in the 1830s. In Britain, the best way to probably put it is the relief system was based on the parish system, which had grown from medieval times, where the local parish took care of their own poor. But in Ireland, where you had 85% Catholic and a state church which was Protestant, which was about 10%, probably had about 5% Presbyterian as well at the time, that system didn't work. And the Poor Law Act set up initially 153, 154, and then expanded to about 166 poor law unions, which set a rate of tax, the poor rate, based on people's land valuations. Now, they weren't based on ownership, because if they were only based on ownership, only rich people would pay the tax. And that would be very unfair to poor people who didn't have the opportunity to contribute in tax. So the taxes were all based on occupancy. So that's why the valuations from that particular time, Griffith's valuation from 1847 to 64, is particularly valuable in finding out where people are. But over the next 30 or 40 years, the poor law unions expanded from the workhouse into the medical area, but also into public health. So the Nuisance Removals Acts. And do you know what nuisance abatement is? So nuisance abatement is the removal of your own personal sewage from your back garden, which is both unsanitary and unhygienic and leaves a smell. So the Nuisance Abatement Acts. Medical Charities Act allowed people who weren't inmates of the workhouse to avail of the services of the local infirmary and the dispensaries. The Public Health Acts, the Sewer Authority, the Sanitary Acts, and it all transferred to the Local Government Board in 1872. So by the time we are talking about this, what we would associate as core responsibilities in terms of water and in terms of sewage that are with the local authorities are with the boards of guardians at that time. And Balroddery Poor Law Union would have been split into 6 dispensary districts: Balbriggan, Homepatrick, Kilsallaghan, Lusk, Swords and Malahide. Malahide included the areas of Kinseely and that's the old spelling of Concealy there. Portmarnock, Clochran, so right over to where the airport is now, and Malahide. And Malahide then would have included Yellow Walls, Malahide Town and the Domain. So if we look at the map here, you'll see roughly the area that would have been included, and it included Beechwood, Bloomfield and all the areas that you see there on the left. Now those boundaries do change slightly over time, so you will see them changing a little bit, but we have an issue that's going to come up now, and I just want you to try and remember the size of the map. So we had an issue that went on for 40 years, and it was to do with contamination on an ongoing basis of water supplies. Now, water for most people, in Dublin, we didn't have a proper water supply in the city until the Vartry system by Edward Dwyer Gray was diverted in 1864. Prior to that, we had an antiquated system that went back to medieval times. So Dublin always had problems with diseases associated with contaminated water. And that was very much the case in Malahide. Most people got their water from the local pump. And if there was a problem with the local pump, there was a problem with the water. However, the more salubrious houses that we see in Killeen Terrace and we see in St. James's Terrace, when they had problems with water and they had problems with disease, they kicked up a bigger fuss than other areas would have. So, James's Terrace, as I said, started to see problems of what I would best describe as reflux. Their sewage would have been coming back up through the pipes. So the pipes that they would have had were clay pipes, and they would have gone out into the estuary, about 40 or 50 yards. They didn't always go that far. That was what they were supposed to. And if you had damage to the pipes, sand would have got into the pipes in the estuary, would have blocked them, and things came back up. Now, my research has indicated that most of these houses had their sculleries, which would have been their kitchen, and particularly where they would have washed their dishes and their pots, at the front of the house and in the basement. So that would have gone directly into a pipe and directly into the sea. And that was where the problem started at this time. Now, I had a look at who was there, living there in 1870. So a number of these are just, let's say, normal citizens. A couple of them stand out. So Richard Stanistreet was a medical practitioner, but he was also the medical officer for the dispensary district of Malahide. Henry Augustus Dillon was a land agent, and I'm going to tell you how wealthy he was a little bit later on, so you'll have an idea of the dynamics that are involved in this. But Henry Dillon was Lord Talbot's land agent, so he would have been responsible for managing the estate, not just within the estate, but all the tenants of Talbot de Malahide. Major French, who was later a lieutenant colonel, was retired Connacht Rangers. And when you see gentleman or gentlewoman is somebody who's living on independent means. They're not somebody who has a job. They're living off investments or inheritance. So that was some of the people that were there at that time. Now this is quite dense, but I'm just going to include it because the key is looking at 1870 and looking at the makeup of the dispensary committee. And the dispensary committee in 1870 was mostly what we would call not necessarily landed aristocracy, but lower levels of the gentry. They're strong farmers and they are predominantly Protestant and predominantly members of the Church of Ireland. And the Church of Ireland had an incredibly tight political network through its vestry memberships and through the various organisations of the Church of Ireland. So Henry Dillon is on it. Isaac Willan, who was also a poor law guardian, was on it. Some of these were also members of the grand jury. Robert Trumbull in Beechwood. Lawrence Neal, and this is important, at this point his name is Lawrence Neal. He is part of the family of what later was Lawrence O'Neill. There were many people called Neil in North County Dublin who changed their name back to O'Neill as the political climate started to change in the period of Home Rule. William Perrin came from a family who were long-standing senior civil servants in Dublin Castle. And in 1874, Dr. Stanistreet reported that there were problems with some of the pumps, particularly in Yellow Walls, where he said it resembled a cesspit. And this was the beginning of long discussions over who is responsible for the water in the area. Should it be private wells? Should it be pumps? And should there be sewage systems introduced? They started to introduce it to some of the houses. Talbot would have introduced it into some of the houses that he owned in Old Street. And slowly in the 1870s, the membership started to slightly change, where more nationalists started to be elected to the dispensary committee. And as they eventually got to the point where they had a majority, they were able to flex their muscles politically through the sanitary committee. Probably the most important directive in this time was in 1879, when Balroddery Poor Law Guardians were told by the local government board that anything that was done for the town had to be levied on the whole area. So remember the map I showed you? And it went to Clochran in the airport, and it went down to the northern part of the borough in Portmarnock. They probably wouldn't benefit from any water system that was centred around St. James's Terrace and the town, but they would have had to pay for it. And this presented an opportunity for the dispensary committee to flex their muscles on that. Now, in the early 1880s, when Charles Stewart Parnell had taken over effectively the leadership of the Home Rule movement as the leader of the Irish Independent Party at Westminster, he encouraged nationalists to run for positions in Poor Law Board of Guardians elections. And where they didn't initially gain leverage, they did on things like library committees and on dispensary committees. There was always somebody who became chairman of the library committee almost everywhere. Does anybody know who that was? It was always the local Catholic parish priest, because if he was head of the library committee, he could control what books were bought. So that is sort of politics and power with two small p's that's very, very effective. Andrew Kettle, who had been a disciple of Isaac Butt and very, very close to Parnell, and in the Land League very, very close to Davitt. He was probably the senior, most influential political figure in nationalism in North County Dublin. Some of you will be familiar with his sons. Lawrence Kettle was the first city engineer with Dublin Corporation, or one of the first ones, and he introduced lighting into Dublin, public electric lighting, and his other son was Tom Kettle, who died in 1916 at the Battle of the Somme and had been an MP. He ran against, that's him up on the top right hand corner, he ran against Thomas Luke Plunkett of Portmarnock House. And he was not only a big landowner and influence, he was Catholic, but he was Unionist. He also owned Portmarnock Brick Company. And I couldn't find a photograph of Thomas Luke Plunkett, but I did find one of his bricks stamped with Portmarnock on it. And if anybody's interested, if you go out, there's a pub, I can't remember the name of it now, but it's in Baldoyle. And just beside the pub, all the bricks have Portmarnock stamped on them, if you wanted to look at that. In 1884, the committee had Andrew Kettle, his brother, Patrick Kettle, A.J. Cusick, who lived in Concealy. We had, actually Abbeyville, where Charles Haughey used to live, was his house. Also, Joseph O'Neill and Patrick O'Neill, who were two cousins, who each had about 140 acres that they farmed in Concealy. They're significant because they're learning their trade, two young men learning the trade of politics. Because in 1899, Patrick, or PJ O'Neill as he was then, became the first chairman of Dublin County Council, a position he held for the next 20 years. His cousin, Joseph, was chairman of North Dublin Rural District Council, again for 20 years. So you have families, not unlike we see in the later 20th century, controlling or having dynasties and connections in terms of local politics. And at this stage, they took control of that particular committee because Andrew Kettle defeated Thomas Luke Plunkett for the chair. And they also took the vice chair, they took the treasurer's position, and they took the secretary's position. So they basically controlled everything. And the secretary is hugely important in something like this because they send out the minutes, they send out the invitations. So if they know what's happening, they can be a little bit selective. This is actually something you can learn about secretaries today. They know who's going to turn up and who's not going to turn up, and if somebody can't go, what way the vote might go. So there's an awful lot of that kind of skullduggery and underhandedness that does happen. In 1884, there were 9 cases of cholera reported in Malahide, and Dr. Stanistreet decided that the best way to treat it was with brandy. So he gave brandy out to all the relieving officers, and they supplied that. But he also, and again, this is something that I've learned elsewhere, Victorians' solutions to most health problems was fresh air. Open everything up. So fresh air and flushing. So half of Collins Barracks, for instance, was knocked down in the 1890s to allow for greater air circulation when they had problems with enteric fever. And enteric fever and typhoid are at the core of this, as they were in Royal Barracks at that time. So they started to open up the sewers. So you had to build up a typhoid. The typhoid problem was compounded by the fact that children were playing at where the pipe outlet went into the sea. So they were getting contracting typhoid and enteric fever, but also the reflux, because of the blockages, was sending it back up the sinks and into the kitchens of the most prestigious street in Malahide, James's Terrace. And that's why it becomes a significant problem. They would have approved opening of a certain amount of places, opening the sewers and then trying to flush them, or at least letting the gases out. So there was a view that, like the issue, say, of miasmas, and there's something in the air, it may be humours, it may be gases, it may be smells, it may be vapours, but that's the problem. And if we can get rid of that, the problem is gone. Waterborne infections weren't as well known at the time. Now, we all know very, very well from practicing like this over 2 or 3 years how infection is spread. They didn't know at that particular time. They were lucky they didn't have fatalities, but they had a number of people that were very, very sick. Even some of the public water supply was condemned by Sir Charles Cameron. So the water pumps weren't being maintained. So you had a series of ongoing problems relating to water at that time, and that continued to cause the problems. Now, this is 1884, James's Terrace, and just in terms of showing you some of the valuations that you had. So we have Richard Stanistreet. Nearly every house that's there is valued at £30. Now, the average labourer's cottage at that time would have been valued at maybe 10 shillings to about 15 shillings. So this is the valuation on these houses. So it will give you an idea of the type of wealth that we're talking about, who wanted the water supply to be provided by the Rural District Council and that everybody else pays for it. So that's at the core of the political issue that's there. A few years later, we still have Charles Dillon and Henry A. Dillon. So Charles is the son of Henry. They're both land agents. We've Colonel French is still there, and Richard Stanistreet is still there. So you have almost like a residents' association for the 11 houses on James's Terrace, taking on with their let's say their allies in high positions, and being blocked by the sanitary committee of the 2 Kettles and the 2 O'Neills who are occupying all the officer positions. So some of these are some of the meetings that are here that have taken place. Unfortunately, the handwriting, while I think it's very good, is not always as easy to read, although maybe it's not as bad as I thought it was on a screen. But this is one of the meetings where they had agreed to have it looked at by a civil engineer, Mr. Berry, and they basically decided that the drainage from St. James's Terrace should continue to go out by the front, and that they should extend in the first instance the pipe out to 40 metres. And this was to be paid for by a local charge. But the overriding directive was that the whole district electoral division or the whole dispensary district would pay for it. And this is the key determinant. So we have a letter here from Patrick O'Neill, which is PJ O'Neill, Honorary Secretary of Malahide Dispensary and Sanitary Committee, stating that at their meeting on the 16th of December 1888, that they could not allow or give their approval for a system that did not benefit everybody. So those that paid, if it was only for the town, they said only the town should pay, or it should be for everybody. And that's the impediment to any progress thereafter. We see that they emphasised this again in 1889. Quite simply, that sort of dichotomy, that split between who should pay, is an opportunity for nationalists to bring in some kind of influence and stopping, basically taking on the powers that be. Now, I would have seen this as well. The land war, for instance, in North County Dublin was not as violent or as hot as it was in other parts of the country. But one of the ways that people did exercise their disapproval or take on the landlords was by poaching. So the landlord would have always had gaming rights on somebody's land. And actually, right up until the 1880s, the punishment for poaching on the statute books was still flogging. Now, nobody was flogged over it, they tended to be fined. But if you poached salmon or rabbits, it was a lack of deference to the landowner, where previously you would have been afraid to do that. This is very, very similar to that. There was a series then of ongoing problems, and they tended to be referred back to full meetings of the Board of Guardians, then back to the Sanitary Committee. And in order to try and get around this, Henry Dillon offered the building we saw earlier, a new dispensary on Main Street with a lease of 99 years at £3 a year. So that is the way politics still works, where somebody will do something and expect something back. So that was as an attempt to try and get around it. Additional sanitary works were needed in the 1890s. Small amount had taken place. Just to give you an example of across the board, there was 53 houses found in the Homepatrick area, which is the area around Skerries, as late as 1892, with no toilets at all. No water closets, no ash pits. So that's somebody basically having a bucket of their stuff, which was thrown out the back. So this is the type of sanitary problems that we are having across the board. At the same time, the group centred around James's Terrace, led by Charles Henry Dillon, started to get independent advice on a system that could be brought in, and they had a number of meetings. Now, they decided that if they built a reservoir to the west of Swords, linked in with the Ward River, that would be sufficient to be able to supply the water to Malahide. The other factor that came in at this stage was the new Grangegorman Annex Asylum, which we now know as Portrane, and that would have needed water as well. But because Portrane was being built, Portrane meant money. So we could bring somebody else in with money to help fund what we were looking for. So there's a number of public meetings took place. They would provide 6 million gallons west of Swords. It would cost about £10,000, which in today's money is about 1.5 million. But within that, we would be looking at almost 50% would have been funded by Portrane and the asylum, with about 2,000 from the local property owners in the Malahide area. Father Mulcahy, who was the head of the library committee here at the time, quite an influential man, at one stage in 1914 there was a famous case that Molly Adrian had wanted to have come on the mom meetings here and train nurses, and he wouldn't let her use the coal for the fires. So that's how important fires were when I said, so he wouldn't let her use the coal because he didn't agree with that kind of Republican sentiment. It is on and off and on and off. And then we start to see other outbreaks of enteric fever, of typhoid, of scarlatina, which is scarlet fever. And it doesn't matter that they're not to do with the water. Every time you have a kind of a moral panic associated with hygiene, associated with disease, you end up, it heightens the emotions around what's happening with the water. Anthony Strong Hussey and Mark Perrin got involved then. They were both officers of the Board of Guardians, and they tried to become almost mediators in it. After the 1898 Act, the rural district councils would have had local district councillors that were elected for Malahide. Patrick Hogan and William Parkinson, both nationalists, both who had shops on, I think, Main Street and New Street, were elected. And it meant Malahide for the first time had somebody who was directly elected by a bigger proportion of the population. This is just, again, giving you an idea of where some of my information came from. This is St. James's Terrace in 1901, and who is living there. And again, we see that the people who are most influential in the area are based on this street, and they are living on an ongoing basis and have been at this stage for nearly 30 years with an ongoing problem. Charles Dillon, the land agent. William Elliott is now the local dispensary doctor. We have a civil engineer. We have Colonel French's, I'm not sure whether that's his widow or his daughter is still there. And we have William Bannister, a builder. So we still have very, very wealthy people who are pressing to have this resolved. I said I'd give you an idea of some of the wealth that was involved. This is a copy of the index of the will of Henry Augustus Dillon, who died in 1892, lived in James's Terrace. He was the land agent for Talbot de Malahide, and he left 5,000 and, just put my glasses on, £5,096, which is about 520,000 in today's money. So he probably could have funded the whole water scheme himself. So again, it is giving you an idea of what the nationalist politicians, local politicians, are up against and what they're trying to challenge. Hogan and Parkinson were re-elected again, and then re-elected again a few years later. The work that was being done at this time was all just tinkering around. Nothing was happening in terms of, because that impediment was still there. Unless the new water scheme is for everybody, there will be no new water scheme. It'll be for nobody. So I know this is a little bit heavy in terms of what's up there, and I don't want to read it, so you can read it yourself. So from about 1904 to 1905, we start to see some improvements, but very, very slow. Now, does that surprise you? Think Metro. Okay? So if you think Metro today and how long that takes, or think the Lewis before the Lewis was built, and you think about this, and this is taking 20 or 30 years. I, by the way, have the original plans at home for the Dart, and there was a Dart to the airport initially, and they ran out of money, and it never happened. There was a Dart to where DCU is. There was a Dart station due to be in Courtlands off Griffith Avenue. There was due to be one in Ballymun. That never happened. So some things don't change over time. Eventually, by 1905, 1906, 1907, we start to see a resolution. We're also starting to see far greater democratisation through Dublin County Council and how Dublin County Council is made up at this time, and the two rural district councils, of nationalists taking power and starting to get things done on the ground. The Irish Builder reported that there was a scheme eventually adopted for £6,500. However, and this is exactly the same as today, we had an objection. And the objection came from Adelaide O'Callaghan in Brackenstown House, who said that the diversion of the Ward River Valley, the Ward River, and the building of the reservoir west of Swords would affect her water. And she appealed to, first of all, the Master of the Rolls, and then for a water scheme in Malahide, it went all the way to the House of Lords. So this is the original 1907 directive from the House of Lords giving permission for the water scheme, and very, very quickly Mrs. O'Callaghan and other people, so that's Brackenstown House, the original Brackenstown House, that burnt down in 1913, and the council was defended by J.J. Clancy, and J.J. Clancy was the MP at that time for North County Dublin. So you had everybody involved in and around this at that particular time. The other people that would have been involved on this in terms of objecting were the Ainger family. So if anybody knows Roganstown Country Club, Golf Club, that's the same Ainger family that would have been involved. And just to give you an idea, there is a list of everybody. And actually, you're talking about people having diversions. Adelaide O'Callaghan, Nicholas Long, Catherine Long, Nicholas Morden, Alice Pentony, William Keeling. He is of the same Keeling's family. So anybody who knows the families of Swords would know nearly everybody was affected. Now, I can't rule out that there's a Swords Malahide dynamic in play here. I can't prove it, I can't be certain of it. But that type of thing is not unknown in Ireland when one thing happens one way or another. So all of these objections were there, but they were dismissed in the House of Lords. So eventually we had approval, having been held up effectively from 1879 and the first directive to almost 1910. It went back and forth again a little bit. The two Malahide councillors actually resigned over it from the Rural District Council, which again brought another level of pressure on. And like everything today, the costs went up the longer it took. So you were looking at about 14,000 instead of the original 7 would eventually be the cost. By 1909, it was still not agreed. The specific costs were still being argued over, and eventually it was to be levied at an extra shilling in 1910 on the rate. So in 1910, it was approved. There was an extra rate put onto the poor law rates at the time. Now, I've looked at everything around that time, and we were probably looking at between your normal poor rate, your heredicament rate, which would be for other buildings, the police rate, which by 1914, I'm looking at 1914 now, which was to pay for the police during the lockout, lighting in Malahide, water in Malahide, and a separate compensation charge in Malahide that people were paying 8 shillings in the pound tax, which is about 40%, which is very, very significant for that time. So within all of that, the water was only a very, very small additional tax. So you'd wonder how and why it continued for as long as it did. So we're looking at something here which is not just about the water and the sewage and hygiene and sanitation problems in Malahide, but it's a case study of how nationalists were able to flex their muscles, were able to learn how to use what we'll call parliamentary procedure or committee procedure, how local government works on the ground, how people are represented by their representatives against a ruling cohort who for a long time had an awful lot of it their own way. One of the reasons the grand jury were despised was because when the grand jury made decisions, let's say up to the 1860s, 1870s, on roads, road repairs, bridges and harbours, they made the decisions in their interest. That's why all the best roads in the country always went up to the front door of the big house. The other roads would have ended up being dirt tracks. So this is a brilliant example of the quiet and the almost silent movement of nationalism to gaining some level of power long before the guns of 1916 or 1919 and 20 or independence in 1922. And this is where we learned how to govern ourselves. Thank you.